They told you everything essential was preserved, but entire books are missing. Intact, and yet gone. The Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Mary, the Codex Gigas, the Shan Hai Jing, they weren't lost by accident. They were removed, forbiddens. Hidden, and in their place, silence. Not a silence of ignorance, but of fear. It begins not with what we know, but with what we are told not to ask. Why, for instance, did early church councils never reference the Book of Enoch, despite its widespread circulation among Jewish and Christian communities before the canon was fixed? Why did Jerome, the father of the Latin Vulgate, express in his letters confusion over books the church no longer recognized, books once copied, cited, and revered? Why did ancient catalogs of Christian writings include dozens of texts? The Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Paul, that now sit outside the sacred wall? And deeper still, why does the earliest physical Christian Bible we possess, the Codex Sinaiticus, c. 4th century, contain texts that later vanishes from history's holy list? Who changed the table of contents of salvation? The record shows a contradiction. In the 3rd century, Origen, one of the great theologians, taught openly about the pre-existence of souls, citing books and teachings now classified as heretical. Yet 200 years later, the Council of Constantinople declared such belief anathema. The same church, a wholly different doctrine, and the bridge between them, forgotten or burned. It's not just a matter of theology. The structure of time itself was altered. The Book of Jubilees, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, outlined an entirely different sacred calendar, 364 days, instead of 365. Its followers believed that adopting the wrong calendar meant worshiping on the wrong days. Desecration. Disguised as devotion, that book was excluded from the canon. Its warning ignored. Did they suppress it because it threatened doctrine, or because it exposed how time had been broken? The Gospel of Mary introduces yet another rupture. It portrays Mary Magdalene not as a prostitute, as centuries of tradition claimed, but as a teacher, a leader, even a visionary above the apostles. Where the mind is, there is the treasure, she says. But where is that treasure now? And who buried it? Why are we told that these texts are apocryphal? Not false, not fraudulent, but not to be read. Even the word is a warning, apokryptine, to hide away. Not destroyed, but quarantined, like dangerous ideas. But why? If these texts are merely imaginative deviations, why ban them at all? Why burn them? In 367 AD, Bishop Athanasius issued an Easter letter that listed for the first time the 27 books we now know as the New Testament. Everything else, he said, was illegitimate, not debated, not discouraged, illegitimate. And from that point forward, scrolls were collected. Libraries were purged. Councils declared their silence. Truth was not born. It was selected. The anomaly intensifies when we move east. The Chinese classic Shan Hai Jing, a mytho-geographic masterpiece dating back over 2,000 years, describes lands, creatures, and astronomical patterns with extraordinary detail. Its maps imply knowledge of regions far beyond China, perhaps mythical, perhaps real. Why did later dynasties dismiss it as childish fantasy? Was it simply outdated or uncomfortably accurate? Consider this. The Voynich manuscript, a mysterious, undeciphered codex written in an unknown script and illustrated with unearthly plants, has no recorded origin, no known authorship, and no plausible function, and yet it survives, not destroyed, not decoded, just preserved, guarded like something waiting for the right time. The church wasn't alone. The Aztec codices, the Popol Vuh of the Maya, the hieroglyphic records of the Inca, all suffered similar fates. Not erased by time, but by force. The Spanish burned entire libraries, branding them works of the devil. What knowledge was reduced to ash? The contradiction is this: if these books were lies, why fear them? And if they were true, why hide them? We're told that history flows forward, each age improving upon the last. But the record doesn't bear this out. Instead, there are gaps, vast orchestrated silences. There are texts that disappear from catalogs without a trace. Others reappear centuries later in caves, buried jars, or secret shelves in old monasteries. Entire gospels found in Nag Hammadi. Magic manuals discovered beneath Vatican vaults. Maps showing continents we weren't supposed to know. These aren't relics. They are ruptures. We begin this series not with certainty, but with fracture. What if the truth of the past wasn't merely hidden? What if it was rewritten? And if the victors wrote history? Who won? There's a silence in Genesis, a gap between verses where something unspeakable once stood. Genesis 6. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Then comes the flood. But what were these sons of God? Why did their union with humans provoke a cataclysm? And why is the next chapter a complete reset, with no explanation but wrath? The Book of Enoch fills this void, and perhaps that is why it was buried. It tells of the Watchers, 200 angels who descended upon Mount Hermon, seduced human women, and taught forbidden arts, astronomy, metallurgy, enchantment. They created the Nephilim, hybrid giants, and unleashed chaos. God, in this version, sends the flood not for mankind's sin, but to cleanse the earth of celestial contamination. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. The Book of Enoch, preserved in full only in the ancient Ethiopian Ge'ez language, outlines names, ranks, locations. Azazel taught humans the secrets of weapons and ornamentation. Samjaza led the pact. They did not fall by accident, they rebelled. But here lies the contradiction. Jude, the canonical New Testament epistle, directly quotes Enoch, calling him the seventh from Adam. If Jude is scripture, how is Enoch not? More, early Christian fathers such as Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Justin Martyr regarded Enoch as inspired. The Epistle of Barnabas, used by some early churches, draws extensively from it. So too does the Dead Sea Scrolls' own calendar in angelology. Only much later, when church doctrine hardened into empire, did Enoch become dangerous. Why? Because it undermines the monopoly on sacred knowledge. Because it reveals that forbidden wisdom comes not from Satan, but from angels, and that the divine realm is divided. And that is unacceptable. Power demands clarity. Heaven above, hell below, man in submission. But Enoch suggests something far older, far more chaotic. It introduces cosmic civil war. Knowledge as infection, revelation as rebellion. There's a historical echo in this silence. In 364 AD, the Council of Laodicea declared a list of canonical books, and Enoch was not among them. The reasons were not theological, but institutional. Its visions clashed with an emerging Christian cosmology of order, hierarchy, and purity. But the text persisted in Ethiopia, in Slavonic fragments, in Qumran jars. Why preserve a book if it was heresy? In 1773, James Bruce brought 3 copies of Enoch back to Europe after a perilous journey through Abyssinia. His find was met not with joy, but suspicion. Why were Enlightenment scholars afraid of a book written 2 millennia earlier? Its visions are apocalyptic, not in the future sense, but in the etymological one. Apocalypsis, unveiling. The Book of Enoch unveils the mechanisms of celestial judgment, the names of heavenly rulers, the architecture of the stars. It offers maps, spiritual, astronomical, ethical, and it blurs the line between divine and monstrous. Its cosmology contradicts the neat models of the later church. Enoch's heavens are many-layered. Its punishments are eternal, but not necessarily moral. The angels who fall do so by will. And the line between salvation and corruption is not a matter of faith, but of knowledge. It dares to say, those who know too much are punished. Not by demons, but by the Most High. What kind of world was this, where curiosity was a sin punishable by flood? Across traditions, similar echoes persist. In the Zoharic Kabbalah, the fall of angels becomes the Shevaret HaKalim, the shattering of vessels, the birth of chaos from divine light. In Islamic lore, Harut and Marut are angels who descended and sinned. In Sumerian myth, the Apkallu, half-divine sages, were banished to the deep after sharing knowledge with humanity. And always, knowledge is restricted. Its giving is treason. How convenient, then, that the Book of Enoch was cast out. Its very structure is strange. It is not a single text, but a compilation, the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Some parts are older than the Pentateuch. Some predict messianic judgment, and some describe events that eerily prefigure later scripture. One fragment -1 Enoch 48 speaks of a Son of Man enthroned in glory, before whom kings tremble. This was written centuries before Christ. Is this prophecy, or a borrowed image? The textual forensic contradiction cannot be dismissed. If this Son of Man predates the Gospels, then what exactly is original? And why were Jewish authorities silent on it? Why did later rabbinical Judaism exclude it from the canon? Why did Rome banish it? Because Enoch challenges control. Its vision is too wild, its hierarchies too unstable. It suggests that power is not fixed in heaven, but in flux. That beings once trusted can fall. That secrets once hidden can leak. Perhaps this is why the text is riddled with cosmic numbers. Why it outlines 364-day years, not 365. Why it insists on a different structure of time, one rejected by both Jewish and Christian authorities. Was it more accurate? Or more ancient? We cannot know. The calendars we use today descend from imperial Rome and papal bulls, not from Enoch. Yet the Dead Sea sectarians lived by Enoch's time. They believed those who worshipped on the wrong day offered prayers to demons. If they were right, whose time do we live in? There is something strange about the calendar. Something off. Not the ordinary drift of days or the occasional leap year, but a deeper fracture. A silence beneath the weeks. An inconsistency in the rhythm of sacred time. Consider this. The ancient Book of Jubilees, often called the Lesser Genesis, presents a year not as 365.25 days, but as 364, 4 quarters of exactly 91 days, 13 weeks per quarter. No leap years. No irregular months, a perfect symmetry. And yet, that calendar no longer exists in any living religious tradition. Jubilees was once widely read, referenced by the sectarians at Qumran, cited by early Christians, and canonized in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But outside of this single surviving lineage, it was purged, not refuted, not disproven, but erased. Why would a sacred calendar, one claiming to be dictated by angels to Moses on Mount Sinai, be so violently excised? Because Jubilees does more than count days. It undermines the architecture of power itself, aligning festivals, holy days, and rituals to a fixed calendar, one that never shifts. The Book of Jubilees exposes a theological scandal. That current calendars are corrupt, that Sabbaths are misaligned, that sacred festivals, from Passover to Shavuot, now fall on false days, that modern worship may be, unknowingly, sacrilege. The historical contradiction emerges immediately. The Essenes, who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, used the Jubilees calendar and viewed the temple priesthood in Jerusalem as apostate precisely for following the lunar solar cycle of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They accused them of observing feasts on wrong days, offering sacrifices at incorrect times, Desecrating the name of God with mathematical negligence. Is that mere doctrinal quibbling? Or was it an accusation of cosmic rebellion? In Jubilees, time is not neutral, it is sacred structure. To deviate from it is not error, it is treason. And the implications run deeper. If we follow Jubilees, then the modern Jewish calendar, lunar with intercalary months, is in error. So too are Christian observances, which tie Easter to the spring equinox and the full moon. This is not a small discrepancy. It is an indictment. Jubilees insists on solar time, a year of 364 days. Not because it is convenient, but because it is divine. The angelic record keepers of heaven count days in 7s and 13s. Every day is fixed. Every festival eternal. But here's the strange thing. 364 is not divisible by 7. A year of 364 days with continuous 7-day weeks causes the year to drift from the solar cycle by 1 day per year. In 4 years, the festivals fall out of alignment with the seasons. Did the authors of Jubilees not know this? Or were they preserving a different kind of time? The Qumran community solved this with intercalation, hidden days added in secret, known only to the elect. A calendar of initiation, of encoded knowledge. And herein lies the deeper danger. A calendar that separates the initiated from the profane. A timekeeping system that grants cosmic alignment only to the few. Jubilees, then, is not merely a book. It is a gate, but there's more. The book rewrites Genesis itself, expanding, annotating, correcting. It claims that all history follows a Jubilee cycle, 49-year periods of renewal and judgment. Abraham's life, the Exodus, the giving of the law, all are inserted into a hidden chronology. Why would someone do this? Because they believed the original timeline was already corrupted. This is the heart of Jubilees, that Scripture had been tampered with, that the transmission from heaven to earth was broken, that only by reordering time itself could the truth be restored. In chapter 6, it accuses the children of Israel of abandoning the appointed days and following the feast days of the Gentiles. This isn't just nationalism. It is apocalypticism. Time for Jubilees is the battlefield, and the enemy is forgetfulness. The priesthood, the temple, the empires, all claim to govern sacred time. Rome named its months after emperors. The Church shifted the Sabbath to Sunday. Gregorian reform adjusted the drift of Julian error, but every correction came with power. Who controls the calendar? Controls the soul. So why was Jubilees buried? Because it challenged every sacred rhythm that followed. Because it revealed that liturgy could be wrong, that priestly rituals could offend, that entire civilizations could be marching to the drumbeat of heresy, unknowingly. There's a deeper irony. While Jubilees was banished from Jewish and Christian canon, it remained in Ethiopia, preserved in the Ge'ez language, just as Enoch was. 2 exiled books. 2 forbidden clocks. What was it about Ethiopian Christianity that welcomed the outcasts of time? In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls shattered scholarly assumptions. Multiple copies of Jubilees were found, alongside calendar scrolls and astronomical texts. These were not fringe documents. They were core to Qumran theology. One scroll, 4QMMT, explicitly condemns the lunar calendar and praises the solar 364-day system. It is a legal document, a covenant, and it aligns perfectly with Jubilees. So why was none of this taught for centuries? Why did medieval scholars assume the Hebrew calendar was always lunar? Why did early church fathers ignore solar rites? Why do today's historians treat Jubilees as folklore? What if the real reason is fear? Because if time itself is unstable, then all rituals depending on time are unstable. And if holy days are misaligned, what becomes of holiness itself? The silence that surrounds Jubilees is not one of irrelevance. but of terror. And still, it whispers. Is your Sabbath the right day? It is one of the most glaring absences in sacred history. Nowhere in the canonical Gospels is the voice of Mary Magdalene heard directly, and yet she is present at the most critical moments. She stands at the cross when the others flee. She is the first to witness the empty tomb, the first to see the risen Christ, the first apostle. And yet, she says nothing. Her voice was silenced, not because she had nothing to say, but because what she said changed everything. In the 19th century, fragments of the Gospel of Mary were uncovered in a 5th century Coptic papyrus. Later, additional Greek fragments were found in Oxyrhynchus. Together, they revealed something astonishing: a dialogue between Mary and the disciples after Christ's resurrection. In it, Mary speaks of visions, of spiritual ascent, of hidden knowledge. And the male disciples, especially Peter, reject her authority. Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Peter asks, are we to turn around and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Mary weeps. Levi defends her. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? It is not just a story. It is a rupture. The historical contradiction is this: Mary Magdalene, depicted in the canonical Gospels as the most devoted follower, disappears entirely from the book of Acts, the official chronicle of the early church. No mention, no memory, nothing. Why? Because the Gospel of Mary reveals a version of early Christianity in which authority was not hierarchical, but experiential. Not apostolic succession, but inner revelation. And it places a woman at the center. This was not merely inconvenient. It was threatening. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as Christianity transitioned from a persecuted movement to a structured religion, the boundaries of authority hardened. Bishops replaced visionaries. Orthodoxy replaced inspiration. Gender roles were codified, often retroactively. A gospel that centered a female teacher, and not just any woman, but one claimed to receive higher knowledge than the male disciples, could not be tolerated. So it was buried. We must linger here in the contradiction. The Gnostic texts of the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contain numerous references to Mary as a revealer of mysteries. In the Pistis Sophia, Christ praises her understanding. In Dialogue of the Savior, she is among those who ask the deepest questions. Yet the church labeled her a prostitute. There is no biblical basis for this. The association of Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman in Luke 7 was first made by Pope Gregory I in 591 AD, nearly 6 centuries after the Gospels were written. He merged multiple women into one and reduced the apostolic witness to a repentant harlot. Why? Because power reshapes memory. The Gospel of Mary doesn't just challenge male authority. It reframes salvation itself. In its surviving passages, Mary describes a journey of the soul, passing through cosmic realms, resisting archonic forces that try to bind it with guilt, fear, and forgetfulness. It is a map of liberation, not through external sacrifice, but inner awakening. And this is the deeper heresy. If salvation is inner knowledge, gnosis, then what need is there for priests, for sacraments, for institutional control? The church could not allow such freedom, nor could empire. And so the text was lost, not in the sands of time, but by deliberate burial. Even the physical record tells a story. The Gospel of Mary is missing 6 crucial pages, including the beginning. Torn out, not decayed, removed. Removed them. When? And what did they contain? Some scholars speculate the missing pages describe the resurrection, not as a physical event, but as a spiritual realization, a cosmic rebirth within. This contradicts the dogma of bodily resurrection, and so it had to vanish. The Gnostic cosmology embedded in Mary's Gospel speaks of a universe controlled by false rulers, archons who trap souls in ignorance. The true God lies beyond. Hidden, ineffable. To awaken is to see past the illusion, to remember one's origin. But the church said no. Salvation came not through awakening, but obedience. And yet, the early evidence suggests otherwise. In early Christian art, Mary Magdalene appears frequently, often with a red egg, symbol of life, mystery, and transformation. In some apocryphal legends, she preaches to emperors, challenges Peter, leads communities. This is not the Mary of later centuries, the weeping penitent. This is Mary the teacher. Even in canonical texts, shadows remain. In John 20, when she encounters the risen Christ, he tells her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended." The Greek word is haptu, not simply touch, but grasp, hold, possess. Is it possible she sought more than physical contact? A spiritual union? A transmission? Why would Jesus appear to her first, and then send her to the others, if she was not entrusted? Why was her testimony not preserved? Unless it was. Unless the Gospels we have are not the whole story, but a curated one. The Gospel of Mary is a fragment, but it fractures the entire edifice. Its existence suggests a church that might have been. A Christianity not of power, but of vision. Not of hierarchy, but of intimacy. And it suggests that the feminine was once not peripheral, but central. So what happened? Was Mary erased because she was a woman? Or because she remembered too much? There is a disquieting note in the Gospel of Matthew, a single sentence that passes almost without notice. When Judas, having betrayed Jesus, throws the 30 silver coins back at the temple, the priests declare, "It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is blood money." They know, they knew, and yet the betrayal proceeds. But what if Judas was never a traitor? What if he was obedient? This is not modern speculation. It is the premise of a buried gospel, unearthed in Egypt in the 1970s, held in obscurity for decades, and only translated in full in 2006, the Gospel of Judas. Its contents are extraordinary. In this version, Judas is not the villain. He is the only disciple who understands Jesus, the only one to grasp the hidden truth. Jesus does not rebuke him. He reveals to him the mysteries of the cosmos, and then commands him, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The betrayal becomes a mission. The death becomes a release. This gospel is not heresy for its strangeness, but for its symmetry. It offers a mirror to the canonical account, and in so doing, inverts the moral order. Good becomes obedience to higher knowledge. Evil becomes the worship of flesh and illusion. The other disciples worship a false god, the demiurge. Judas alone sees beyond, and that is unforgivable. Historically, the Gospel of Judas aligns with Sethian Gnosticism, a strand of early Christianity that viewed the material world as the creation of a lower, ignorant deity. Salvation was escape, not redemption. Knowledge, not faith. The true God, they believed, was beyond being unknowable, ineffable, pure light. In this vision, Jesus did not die for sins. He escaped the prison of matter. In Judas was his liberator. The contradiction becomes unbearable. How can the church maintain moral clarity when the lines blur? When the villain becomes the initiate? When the cross is not a sacrifice, but a shedding? The Gospel of Judas survives in a single Coptic manuscript, Codex Chakos, carbon dated to the 3rd or 4th century, but likely a translation from a much older Greek text. It was not forged. It was suppressed. Irenaeus, writing in 180 AD, denounced it by name and is against heresies. They declare that Judas the traitor, alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. He knew of it. He feared it. What does it mean when the earliest theologians felt the need to refute a gospel by name? It means it was being read, taught, believed, and then it was gone. Why? Because it did not fit the narrative. Not just doctrinally, But politically, the early church was aligning itself with Roman order, constructing authority, hierarchy, discipline. To tell a story in which the state executes God by mistake, that is tolerable. But to say the execution was necessary, ordained, that a disciple aided the process with divine approval, that destabilizes the entire salvific myth. In this gospel, Jesus laughs. Not at Judas, but at the other disciples, their misunderstanding, their worship of flesh, their ignorance of the deeper realms. He is a revealer, not a redeemer. And Judas, far from being a demon, is told, "You will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them." Is this metaphor or prophecy? There is a disturbing resonance with other texts. In the Pistis Sophia, Jesus speaks of layered heavens, of beings that trap souls in cycles of rebirth. In Apocryphon of John, the demiurge creates the world in ignorance, proclaiming, "I am God, and there is no other," unaware of the greater power beyond. These texts all share one motif: reversal. The God of Genesis is not the highest God. The law is not liberation. And those who oppose the system, the serpent, Cain, Judas, may not be enemies, but agents of awakening. This is unacceptable to empire. To order. To claim that evil is misunderstood is to invite chaos. But history contains clues. In certain early Syriac traditions, Judas is not condemned but pitied. In medieval mysticism, the idea of necessary betrayal surfaces, the fortunate fall, the felix culpa. Even in Dante's Inferno, Judas receives the harshest punishment, frozen in the mouth of Satan, but the extremity of it suggests anxiety, not certainty. Why such overkill for a man who fulfilled prophecy? That is the contradiction. If Jesus had to die to save the world, why is the man who made it happen damned? And deeper still, why did Jesus choose Judas, knowing he would betray him? Unless that was the point. The Gospel of Judas forces a confrontation between morality and mystery, between narrative and paradox. It dares to suggest that betrayal is divine, that salvation requires rupture, that the one cursed by men is chosen by heaven, and that the church got it all backwards. So we are left with the question the text dares to ask: who really betrayed whom? There is a book that should not exist, massive, medieval, and inexplicable. It defies both logic and theology. The Codex Gigas, or Giant Book, is the largest known medieval manuscript in the world. It stands nearly 3 feet tall, over 160 pounds, composed of more than 300 sheets of vellum made from at least 160 calfskins. Created in a single stroke of monastic obsession, or possession, its origin is cloaked in contradiction. The legend is whispered. A monk, condemned to death for violating his vows, offered to create a book encompassing all knowledge, sacred and profane, in a single night, to atone. When midnight passed and the task proved impossible, he made a pact with the devil. And by dawn, the book was complete. The proof, they say, is within. Folio 290 contains a full-page portrait of the devil, horned, crowned, crouched in a void. It is unique in all medieval manuscript tradition. No other religious text of the era dares render Lucifer so vividly, so centrally, and with no apparent allegory. He is not shown falling, not chained. He is enthroned. Why would a Benedictine monk, sworn to God, place the devil at the heart of a holy manuscript? And why does the Codex bear no sign of collaborative work, no evidence of multiple scribes? Analysis reveals that the same hand penned the entire book, from Genesis to the incantations of exorcism, with consistent calligraphy, ink, and spacing. A task that should have taken decades, completed in silence. The contents themselves are strange. The Codex Gigas includes the full Latin Bible, but also medical texts, incantations, astrological calendars, penitential formulas, magical cures, and invocations. It is not a Bible, it is a library. And Not all of it is sacred. It includes the Ars Medicinae of Constantinus Africanus, a book on disease and diagnosis. The Chronica Bomorum, a history of Bohemia. Lists of local abbots. Calendar charts. Necromantic formulas. It is a convergence of opposites, scripture and sorcery, healing and heresy, light and shadow. Why? The physical artifact deepens the mystery. There is no known benefactor, no definitive patron, no ecclesiastical commission. The book appears suddenly in the 13th century in Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, and then begins a strange pilgrimage. Through royal and imperial hands. It was taken by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, a ruler obsessed with alchemy, astrology, and occult manuscripts. His Prague court became a hub of esoteric experimentation. Scholars, heretics, magicians all converged there. Rudolf was later declared insane. The codex passed into the Swedish royal collection during the 30 Years' War, seized as a prize from Prague in 1648, a book of conquest, but it burned. Parts of it anyway. 32 leaves missing. Torn or destroyed in a fire. Why those pages? What did they contain? Scholars speculate. Lost rituals? Imperial secrets? Ciphers? The remaining pages include a series of penitential prayers, followed directly by magical spells. There is no transition. No explanation. Just the sacred bleeding into the forbiddens. And then the devil. Art historians have failed to explain the portrait's placement. Why this image in this position? The page layout is uncharacteristic. The colors unlike any others in the manuscript. It feels inserted, forced. As though the book itself bears a scar. Monastic records claim the codex was kept in isolation. Some said it cursed its holders. Others claimed it protected their abbey from fire, despite the rest of the monastery burning. The codex remained intact. Is this mere superstition? Or something more? The contradiction grows louder. The Church, which condemned most magical texts, preserved this one. Unlike the Key of Solomon, Picatrix, or the grimoires of later centuries, the Codex Gigas was never placed on the index of forbidden books. Why? Because it contained scripture? Or because it was too dangerous to destroy? We must remember, vellum was costly. Sacred books were copied with care. No monk would waste a page, let alone hundreds, on heretical indulgence. And yet here we find incantations for invoking spirits, remedies involving planetary alignments, a calendar rooted not in liturgical seasons, but in zodiacal configurations. It is, in every sense, an anomaly, a Bible too big to read. Too strange to classify. And too enduring to forget. In Prague, it was called the Devil's Bible, but that title may say more about the observer than the text. What kind of mind could create such a thing? And what kind of institution would preserve it? Perhaps the real horror of the Codex Gigas is not its image of Satan, but its seamless stitching of the sacred and the profane, its refusal to separate the two, its suggestion that holiness is not pure, but hybrid. So we ask again, who placed the devil in the margins of Scripture? And what did they want us to see? There exists a book that speaks in a language no one has ever spoken, and yet it does so fluently. The Voynich manuscript, bound in soft vellum, its pages yellowed with age, its script flowing with hypnotic consistency, is perhaps the most studied, unreadable text in human history. Written sometime in the early 15th century or earlier, it contains over 240 pages of botanical diagrams, naked bathing women, astronomical charts, and passages of smooth, flowing text in an alphabet that exists nowhere else. It has resisted every cryptographic attempt for over a century. How can a book be so legible, yet so impenetrable? The contradiction is sharp. Languages evolve. They leave cousins, ancestors, borrowings, mutations. But the Voynich script, sometimes called Voynichese, appears to have none. No parallel, no family, no roots. No decay, Linguists cannot place it. Historians cannot trace it. Botanists cannot identify its plants. Astronomers cannot reconcile its stars. And yet, someone made it. The script is too consistent to be random. The spacing, frequency patterns, and glyph distribution mirror natural human language. Statistical analysis shows that it obeys Zipf's law, the pattern by which real words in natural languages occur. The glyphs cluster into words, and those words into lines and paragraphs. The structure is there, but meaning isn't. What does it say? Some claim it's a hoax. But if so, it's an extraordinary one, centuries ahead of its time. Not a single error, not a single correction. Over 170,000 glyphs, all neatly formed, all consistent, written without hesitation. Who could fake that, and why? Carbon dating of the vellum places the manuscript between 1404 and 1438. The ink matches. The materials are authentic. There is no sign it was tampered with later. It is not modern. It simply does not belong, and the imagery deepens the dissonance. Plants are drawn in careful detail, roots, leaves, blossoms, yet no known flora match them. Not in Europe, not in Asia, not in the Americas. The manuscript contains over 100 species. Not one can be confidently identified. Then come the balneological sections, pages of nude women bathing in interconnected pools, surrounded by tubes and stars and liquid channels. Their poses are ritualistic, their expressions serene. Their bodies merge into the water, some seem to dissolve, others emerge. What was this? A treatise on healing? A coded alchemical manuscript? A manual for spiritual transformation? Why the nudity? Why? The stars? The astronomical diagrams appear to show zodiac constellations, but with mismatched symbols. One chart features 12 depictions of crowned women holding stars, but the stars don't match the known zodiac. Other diagrams include concentric circles, spirals, and cosmic wheels, but they align with no known cosmology. It is as though the book comes from a parallel tradition, one that evolved in secret, outside the bounds of known history. Where? The provenance of the manuscript leads nowhere conclusive. It was acquired in 1912 by Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish rare book dealer from a Jesuit collection in Italy. He believed it to be the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English philosopher. Later, others speculated John Dee, the occultist advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, may have possessed it. Dee's son noted in his diary the loss of a strange book, written in unknown characters, but there is no proof. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, the same monarch obsessed with the Codex Gigas, may have purchased the Voynich manuscript for 600 gold ducats. It passed through hands of alchemists, scholars, and Jesuits. All left it unread. Its history is stitched with silence. The contradiction sharpens when we realize this manuscript was never condemned, never banned, never burned. Why? The Church, known for its aggressive censorship, ignored it. The Inquisition left no comment. No council declared it heretical. Was it too strange to be threatening, or too important to destroy? The structure of the text suggests sections: botanical, balneological, astronomical, cosmological, pharmacological, and finally, what appears to be a continuous narrative. But without a key, or even a single deciphered word, we cannot confirm anything. It is a book that refuses meaning, yet demands interpretation. Modern AI, deep learning models, and pattern analysis have all been thrown against its fortress. Some claim it is an invented language. Others say it's a glossolalia text, spirit-driven, automatic writing. A few argue it is a semic, writing meant to evoke, but never say. But this would make it an early 15th century piece of performance art. Too early. Too complex. Even if it were a cipher, it would be centuries beyond the code-breaking techniques of the Renaissance. Too advanced to have been cracked then. Too baffling to be cracked now. So what kind of knowledge would need to be hidden so carefully? There are whispers in occult circles that the Voynich manuscript is not a book for reading, but a book for triggering. That it is not meant to be understood, but remembered. That its language, symbols, and images bypass cognition and act on the subconscious. That it was designed for the initiated, or the forgotten. In this view, the manuscript is not a hoax, but a key. Not a message, but a map. A symbolic engine of reactivation, meant to awaken knowledge buried not in the world, but in us. And if so, who built such a thing? The contradiction remains unresolved. The Voynich manuscript sits in Yale University's Beinecke Library, catalogued, digitized, studied, but never understood. It is safe, preserved, yet it burns with mystery. Perhaps the question is not, what does it say? But rather, what was it trying to make us remember? There is a silence between the stars and the soul, a gap where modern thought insists there is nothing. And yet the ancients once believed this space was not empty, but overflowing. The Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of sacred philosophical dialogues, conversations between a mysterious figure named Hermes Trismegistus and various disciples, concerning the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, the origin of the soul, and the path to divine knowledge. It is not scripture. It is not science. It is something in between or beyond. And for a time, it was believed to be older than Moses. The Corpus Hermeticum appeared suddenly in Renaissance Italy, when a monk named Leonardo of Pistoia brought a Greek manuscript from Macedonia to the Florentine court of Cosimo de' Medici. The year was 1460. Cosimo, though aging, demanded that his resident scholar Marsilio Ficino cease translating Plato and begin immediately with this. Why? Because the Hermetic texts claimed to be the true wisdom of Egypt, older than Greece, older than Judea, containing the original teachings of Thoth, the god of wisdom. They spoke of a divine mind, nous, a cosmos generated through resonance and thought, a human soul trapped in matter, and a path of return through understanding. For a Renaissance desperate to bridge the sacred and the scientific, the Hermetica were salvation. But then the contradiction struck. In 1614, scholar Isaac Casaubon used linguistic analysis to show that the Corpus Hermeticum could not be ancient Egyptian. It was written in a post-Platonic Greek dialect, dating no earlier than the 2nd or 3rd century CE. The texts, long believed to predate Christianity, were suddenly declared forgeries overnight. The Corpus Hermeticum fell from divine revelation to historical curiosity, but the texts themselves did not change. They still taught that all things emanate from the One, that the stars influence but do not rule, that the human being is a microcosm, a mirror of the divine machine, that thought is creative, that reality is layered, that the visible is only a crust. And perhaps that is what frightened the Church, because the Hermetic worldview bypasses priest and ritual. It offers no need for salvation through blood, no eternal damnation, no dependence on ecclesiastical structures. It proposes instead that the world itself is divine, but fallen into. ULNESS. The task is not to be saved. The task is to remember. One of the most provocative texts, Poimanders, opens with a vision, a being of light, calling himself the mind of sovereignty, reveals to Hermes the architecture of the universe. The cosmos was created by sound, by logos, by vibration. The elements arise. The spheres spin. The stars sing, and humanity is made not in flesh, but in the image of the divine intellect. Here lies the fracture. The Corpus Hermeticum describes a fall, not of sin, but of entanglement. The soul descends through the planetary spheres, each layer imparting limitations, fate, desire, speech, pride, and so on. Only by reversing this descent, by gnosis, by inner ascent, can one return. There is no Satan, no hell. There is ignorance. Compare this to the early Christian Church, which insisted on bodily resurrection, literal judgment, and exclusive salvation. Hermeticism, by contrast, teaches that all souls are divine, but asleep. All are capable of awakening, and awakening is heresy. The Hermetic texts were buried not in soil, but in ridicule. Declared Neoplatonic nonsense, pushed to the edge of philosophical respectability. And yet, they never disappeared. In fact, they birthed entire movements. Renaissance alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Christian Kabbalah, and even Enlightenment science trace their lineage to Hermetic principles. The idea that the world is comprehensible through pattern, that nature is a book to be read, that human reason can penetrate the heavens. Kepler, Newton, Bruno, all read Hermetic texts. Why did the Church never fully outlaw them? Because the Hermetica speak in paradox. They sound pious. They mention God, the Father, the All. They appear compatible, but under the surface, they dismantle theology. One Hermetic fragment states, "That which is below is like that which is above." The as above, so below principle, endlessly quoted, endlessly misunderstood, suggests a symmetry between macrocosm and microcosm. But if this is true, then no priest is needed. Every person is a temple. Another text declares, God is an intelligible sphere, whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. This is not a doctrine. It is a destabilization, a geometrical cone that explodes hierarchy. The Church of the 17th century preferred the closed model. Heaven above, earth below, sin in the middle, priests at the gate. The Hermetica offered instead a continuum, consciousness, as cosmos. And so they were shelved, not banned, not burned. Simply excluded. Even now, they linger in the margins. Read by the esoteric, quoted in footnotes, whispered in occult circles, because they offer something terrifying, that we do not need to be redeemed, we need only to awaken. And so we must ask, what would happen if everyone realized the divine was not above, but within? It began with a farmer's accidental strike of a spade in 1945, a clink against pottery beneath the sands of Nag Hammadi, Egypt. What he uncovered was not gold or bone, but words. Words lost for over 1,500 years. Contained within the earthen jar were 13 leather-bound codices, brittle with time, inscribed in Coptic, their pages filled with teachings unlike anything the Church had preserved. They spoke not of sin and redemption, not of one God and one Son, but of a shattered cosmos, of a divine spark buried in human flesh, and of eons, emanations of light, fractured by desire. They are now called the Nag Hammadi texts, and they are the single greatest threat to Christian orthodoxy ever unearthed. Why? Because they rewrite the foundations of belief. At the center of these texts is a movement now known as Gnosticism, from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge. But this is not academic knowledge. It is experiential knowing, direct, internal, revelatory. The Gnostics claimed that the material world was a prison, that it was not created by the true God, but by a false one, the demiurge, a blind and arrogant architect who declared, I am God, and there is no other, unaware that he was a pale shadow of the true source, and that we humans carry within us a divine spark from that hidden, unreachable light. The contradiction could not be sharper, where the Church taught that God created the world and called it good. The Gnostics taught that the world is a cosmic accident, or worse, a trap, where the Church taught obedience to divine law. The Gnostics taught liberation through inner realization, where the Church taught that Jesus died to save us from sin. The Gnostics taught that Christ descended to awaken us, not as a man, but as a revealer, a light being, a whisper through illusion. Consider the Apocryphon of John, one of the Nag Hammadi texts. It tells a tale of the creation not by a single benevolent God, but by a series of divine emanations. The final flawed emanation, Sophia, acts without consent, and gives rise to the demiurge, Yaldabaoth. He builds the world, ignorant of the light, He traps souls in flesh. And Christ comes not to die, but to remind us who we are. This was heresy so extreme it required erasure. And erase it they did. By the 4th century. The Gnostic texts had been condemned by bishops, burned by councils, and overwritten by Orthodox theologians. Only echoes remained in the polemics of Irenaeus, the refutations of Tertullian, the apologetics of Epiphanius, until Nag Hammadi. Now, we could read their voices directly, and what they say is destabilizing. The Gospel of Thomas, perhaps the most famous of the recovered texts, contains 114 sayings of Jesus, no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just teachings, many parallel canonical Gospels, but others do not. One saying reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." Another, "The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. Split a piece of wood, and I am there." This is not the Jesus of churches. This is the Jesus of mystery. No cross, no creed, just awakening. Why was this gospel not included in the Bible? Because it teaches that salvation is not through belief, but through seeing. There are deeper contradictions. In the gospel of truth, Christ is the manifestation of knowledge. He enters the world to correct error, not to pay for sin. The fall is not moral, but ontological, a forgetting, not a rebellion. The cross is not redemptive suffering. It is a symbol of triumph over ignorance. And in the thunder, perfect mind, the speaker is feminine and divine. I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the whore and the holy one. This is Sophia. Not Mary, not Eve, a goddess fractured and embodied, a voice of paradox. And of power. Why was she erased? Because Gnostic cosmology does not tolerate singular truth. It speaks in riddles, contradictions, and revelations. It suggests that reality is layered, and that any claim to total truth is part of the trap. And this threatens not only doctrine, but hierarchy. For if every soul contains the divine, who needs a bishop? If salvation is inner knowing, who needs a church? The Nag Hammadi texts were not lost accidentally. They were hidden, likely by monks who feared their destruction, during a time when the empire and the church became one. It is no coincidence that in 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea declared a single creed, a single canon, a single path. From then on, all others were illegitimate, yet the scrolls remained buried in the desert. Waiting. And now we must ask, if the early church had preserved these texts, what would Christianity look like today? Would it be a temple or a mirror? There is an ancient book that dares to put power in human hands, not borrowed from a deity, not granted by ritual lineage, but taken by force, by symbol, by name. It is called the Clavicula Salomonis, or the Key of Solomon, and it claims to be written by the wisest king in history, Solomon, son of David, ruler of Israel, master of angels and demons alike. This is not the Solomon of Sunday sermons. This is the Solomon who commanded spirits, built a temple through magical rites, and left behind instructions on how to bend the very forces of heaven and hell to one's will. And therein lies the contradiction. The Key of Solomon is not a medieval invention. Though the oldest complete manuscripts date to the 14th and 15th centuries, in Latin, Italian, Greek, internal textual analysis points to a much older, possibly Hellenistic origin. Elements of its magic mirror Egyptian, Chaldean, and Babylonian practices. It does not emerge from Christian orthodoxy, but from a current buried beneath it. And yet, this book, which teaches how to summon angels, constrain demons, purify space, and consecrate magical tools, was never included in any Christian canon, never accepted in Jewish halakha. And yet it survives in dozens of copies. The very name is a clue. Solomon. In the Old Testament, Solomon is said to have 700 wives, 300 concubines, and divine wisdom. He judges wisely, builds the first temple, speaks with God. But outside the Bible, in apocryphal texts, his legend Darken stat in the Testament of Solomon, a pseudepigraphal text dated to the early centuries CE, Solomon receives a magical ring from the archangel Michael, a ring inscribed with the seal of God, capable of commanding spirits. With this ring, he binds demons to construct the Temple of Jerusalem. He interrogates them, catalogs them. He even binds Asmodeus, the demon of lust, and forces him to carry stones. These stories were not accepted by rabbinical Judaism, nor embraced by the Church, but the legends endured in Kabbalah, in Islamic lore, in medieval grimoires. Solomon became the archetype of the magician king. His seal, two interlocking triangles, now known as the Star of David, became not just a religious symbol, but a magical one. And from these legends emerged the key. The text is structured as a manual. Divided into 2 books, it gives detailed instructions: how to prepare a ritual space, what days and hours are aligned with what spirits, how to inscribe magical circles, blades, censers, talismans. It is systematic, calculated, as if magic were not mystery, but mathematics. It invokes the names of God, not one, but dozens. Hebrew divine names, Latin invocations, angelic hierarchies, all structured into an operable cosmology. This is not folk magic. This is sacred engineering. But why would a biblical king be associated with such a system? Because Solomon, in the shadows of history, becomes something else, a bridge between monotheism and mystery cults, between sacred law and esoteric power. The key was never sanctioned by Rome. In fact, it was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's list of banned books. But even this ban came late. The text circulated in manuscript form for centuries, quietly copied by monks, nobles, alchemists, even priests. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. If the key is pure superstition, why was it preserved in so many languages in such precise, ceremonial script? If it is demonic, why do its rituals demand purity, abstinence, confession, and invocations of divine names? The answer lies in what it offers. Control. The key gives the practitioner the illusion, or perhaps the reality, of agency over the unseen. Not through faith, but through action. Through circles, words, alignments. Through knowledge. And knowledge has always threatened power. This is why grimoires like the Key of Solomon were hunted, not debated. Destroyed, not debated. The Church could tolerate heresy, but not competition. It's telling that even royalty sought this forbidden text. Manuscripts were found in the libraries of European monarchs, the Medici, the Habsburgs. Even Queen Christina of Sweden, who abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and spent her life in Rome surrounded by alchemists and mystics, owned a copy. The elite did not dismiss the key, they studied it, because it maps the unseen. Instructions within align lunar phases with angelic orders. Days of the week with planetary spirits. Incantations with metals, herbs, colors, and symbols. It is an encyclopedia of correspondences, a blueprint of hidden architecture. And its central premise is blasphemous, that the divine, the sacred, can be commanded. The magician, purified and prepared, does not beg, he invokes, he binds. He threatens spirits in the name of higher powers. He acts as a sovereign. This is not religion. It is rebellion. In a world where sacred power was mediated through priests, churches, and sacraments, the magician was a heretic by default, not for what he believed, but for what he attempted. And yet, Solomon remains revered. His name adorns churches, synagogues, mosques. His legend lingers in architecture, ritual, myth. But his key remains in the shadows, copied by hand, hidden in trunks, transmitted in whispers. So we are left with a question that history refuses to answer. If Solomon commanded angels and demons, what king ever ruled him? There is a book that Reads like a spell disguised as science, a fusion of mathematics, astrology, and ritual invocation, crafted not for worship, but for dominion. Its name is Picatrix, and its purpose is clear, to manipulate the very fabric of the cosmos. It is one of the most infamous grimoires ever composed, not for its demons or blood rites, but for its ambition. The Picatrix seeks to align human will with celestial power. It teaches how to bend the planets toward intention, how to construct talismans that ensnare the essence of Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn. It does not beg the stars for favor, it rearranges them. And here is the contradiction. This manual of planetary magic was translated, copied, and studied across the Islamic and Christian worlds, not by peasants or fringe mystics, but by scholars, physicians, and rulers. What kind of knowledge blurs the line between astrology and sorcery, cosmology and conquest? The Picatrix was originally written in Arabic around the 10th century, under the title Gayat al-Wakim, the aim of the sage. It is attributed pseudonymously to Maslama al-Majrita, though no original author can be conclusively confirmed. The text is a compilation, a vast synthesis of Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Indian, Babylonian, and Egyptian magical traditions. Its translation into Latin in 1256, under the patronage of King Alfonso X of Castile, gave it a new name, Picatrix. It rapidly spread throughout medieval Europe, quietly influencing the development of natural philosophy, early science, and courtly magic. Why would a Christian king endorse the translation of a text rooted in pagan theurgy? Because the Picatrix doesn't just describe the heavens, it weaponizes them. Within its chapters are instructions on constructing planetary talismans, ritual objects imbued with the essence of specific celestial alignments. These are not passive charms, they are designed for influence. A talisman of Venus might inspire love or beauty. One of Saturn might bring death to an enemy. One of Mercury, cunning and persuasion. But such rituals require more than craft. They demand precise timing, the hour, the day, the position of the moon, the correct herbs, metals, symbols, and always intention. The Nia, the will. This is not superstition. It is precision. And it forces us to ask, how did such a system survive under empires that publicly condemned all magic? The answer lies in secrecy, in selective memory. The same courts that punished heresy kept court astrologers. The same theologians who wrote anathemas consulted horoscopes. Even Thomas Aquinas admitted that celestial bodies could influence temperament, though he denied that they determined the will. But the Picatrix goes further. It claims that reality itself is shaped by the imagination, that the human soul, properly trained and aligned, can imprint its will upon the world through the medium of the stars. This is metaphysics turned inside out. It echoes ancient Hermetic doctrine. As above, so below. But here, the relationship is not merely reflective, it is active. The soul does not mirror the cosmos. It manipulates it. This is what made the Picatrix dangerous, because it collapses the divide between science and sorcery, between sacred and profane. It does not reject religion, it retools it. It quotes Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, the Quran, and unnamed sages of Chaldea. It does not care for orthodoxy. It cares for efficacy. And for centuries, it worked. Marsilio Ficino, the Renaissance philosopher and translator of Plato, used techniques from Picatrix to attract planetary influences for creativity and intellect. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, in his 3 books of occult philosophy, drew directly from its instructions. Athanasius Kircher, physician to popes, cited its philosophy. Even Isaac Newton, alchemist, astrologer, and architect of gravity, owned copies of texts rooted in the same planetary magic. So where is the line? The Church declared all magic anathema. The Council of Trent reinforced the prohibition of astrology and talismans. The Picatrix was never formally placed on the index of forbidden books, likely because few dared to name it, but still it circulated, secretly, copied, hidden in grimoires, passed among philosophers and nobility, whispered by those who understood that power is not always visible. And here's the deeper fracture. Picatrix insists that the universe is not inert. It is alive, intentional, layered, that matter and spirit are not opposites, but degrees. That the human mind, through symbols, will, and ritual, can resonate with planetary forces and change outcomes. This is not passive astrology. It is planetary engineering. And so the church had no answer. They could condemn, yes, but they could not erase. The Picatrix kept reappearing in Arabic, Latin, Catalan, Italian. Scribal copies bear the fingerprints of centuries, always slightly altered, always reassembled. As if the book itself refused to die. Even now, it circulates among occultists, ceremonial magicians, scholars of esoterica, and its instructions still work. For those who believe in alignment, in resonance, in causality, beyond the material. So we must ask, what kind of reality allows thought to influence orbit? What kind of cosmos responds to ritual? And if it does, who controls the stars now? It begins in ashes, not metaphorically, but literally. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Keshia Maya, was nearly erased from the world by fire. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was remembered. Too vividly, too differently, too dangerously. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they didn't just bring swords and crosses, they brought bonfires. They burned codices, scrolls, glyphs, oral memory rendered onto bark and hide. In 1562, Friar Diego de Landa ordered the destruction of Mayan texts in Yucatan. "We found a great number of books in these characters," he wrote, "and since they contained nothing in which there was not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Only 4 Mayan codices survived. But one voice, buried, translated, transcribed, slipped through. The Popol Vuh. It is not a chronicle. It is not a myth. It is a cosmology, lyrical, elliptical, encoded. And it tells a genesis unlike any other. In the beginning, the gods attempt to make humans. First from mud, they dissolve. Then from wood, they are soulless. And finally, from maize, the sacred substance of life. Only the maize people endure. Here lies the first fracture. Human origins, not from sin or dust, but from sustenance. Not fallen, but cultivated. Maize was not just food. It was being. But the Popol Vuh goes further. It tells of twin heroes, Hunnup and Zbalancha, who descend into the underworld of Xibalba, overcome the lords of death through cunning and sacrifice, and ascend as the sun and moon. This is not descent into hell for punishment. It is descent for transformation. The structure is unmistakably initiatory. It mirrors, with haunting similarity, the mystery traditions of the old world: death and rebirth, underworld trials, sacred duality. Yet it emerged in complete isolation from them, and that is the contradiction. How can cultures with no contact share such parallel spiritual architectures? Did the Maya develop these symbols independently, or was there once a broader memory, now fragmented? The Popol Vuh is filled with cosmological precision, planetary cycles, agricultural rites, calendars, of uncanny astronomical sophistication. The Mayan long count system tracks solar years, lunar phases, Venusian cycles, eclipses with a complexity rivaling Babylon and Alexandria. How? Western narratives often speak of linear advancement, from primitive myth to modern science. But the Maya were building observatories before Galileo. They calculated the solar year to within minutes. The Popol Vuh contains references to celestial alignments, sacred numbers, and cyclical epochs of destruction and renewal. And yet, the book was condemned as fable, a curiosity, a primitive tale. Why? because it challenged the singularity of the Western Genesis, because it presented not one creation, but several. Not one fall, but multiple. Not a chosen people, but an evolving humanity, shaped by trial and error. The Popol Vuh undermines the teleological arc of Christian imperialism. It does not place man at the center. It offers no dominion over beasts. It describes a cosmos alive with negotiation, failure, cunning. A world built in conversation, not command. This was unacceptable to the Church and to empire. So they rewrote the memory. The surviving Popol Vuh we have today was transcribed in the 16th century by a K'iche' nobleman in Latin script. But in the original Mayan language, it was hidden. Later translated into Spanish by Dominican friar Francisco Ximenez, who copied the text, but filtered it through Christian framing. Even in preservation, it was altered. And yet, something remains. Its rhythms, its shadows, its refusal to resolve. Throughout the text, the line between gods and humans is porous. The hero twins are not born of man and woman, but from the head of their father, planted on a tree. They die, they resurrect, they dance in disguise. They trick the gods of death into self-destruction. It is not morality tale. It is code, and encoded within it is a warning. Every creation ends. Civilizations rise and fall. The gods destroy and try again. Time is not linear, it loops. The fourth world collapses. The fifth begins. What does it mean that this cyclical vision, once burned by the colonizers, now echoes with the collapse of our own systems? What does it mean that the Popol Vuh, so violently suppressed, predicted the end of ages? There are numerical clues throughout the text. The 13 levels of the heavens, the 9 levels of the underworld, the 260-day sacred calendar, Tzolk'in, linked to human gestation. This is not symbolic numerology. This is cosmobbiology. And it reveals a terrifying implication. The Maya did not measure time abstractly. They measured it through embodiment. And if time lives in the body, then every epoch is etched in us. So why were these teachings called demonic? Because they threatened control. The Church needed time to be linear, with a beginning and an end. The state needed humans to be created once, broken once, saved once. The Popol Vuh offered no such finality. It taught that gods fail, that humans are remade, that cycles return. And that death is not punishment, but passage, which raises the unspoken question, what if our own world is not the first? What if we are already someone's fifth attempt? There exists a book so ancient, so sprawling, so filled with beasts, gods, and sacred geography that even scholars of its own civilization eventually called it myth. Its name is Shan Hai Jing. The classic of mountains and seas. It is said to be compiled over centuries, from the Warring States period, c. 4th century BCE, through the Han Dynasty, and possibly earlier. But no one agrees on its purpose. Is it an atlas, a bestiary, a religious manual, a coded treatise on cosmology? The contradiction begins at first glance. It presents itself as a geographic text, listing mountain ranges, rivers, minerals, strange plants and animals, and ritual instructions for sacrifices at specific peaks and waters. Yet these places are adorned with impossible things: three-headed birds, talking dragons, people with faces in their chests, serpents with human voices. And yet, some of the locations are real. What kind of book mixes accurate topography with mythological anatomy? What kind of map does not distinguish between Earth and the other world? And why was it dismissed? The Shan Hai Jing contains more than 30,000 characters across 18 chapters, describing over 500 mountains and 300 watercourses. It names hundreds of deities, spirits, and monsters. It lists precise measurements: 200 li east, a bronze mountain 800 jang tall, a creature that sings like a flute. This is not chaotic invention. It is systematized, repetitive, taxonomic. So why did later dynasties label it childish or absurd? Because it remembers a world that the state needed to forget. In traditional Chinese historiography, the establishment of dynastic order is paired with the suppression of cosmological plurality. The Qin dynasty, in unifying the script and standardizing measurement, also narrowed acceptable cosmology. The Han court elevated Confucianism, codified celestial hierarchy, and rewrote the past. The Shan Hai Jing, too wild to control, too sacred to destroy, was relegated to obscurity. Kept, but not canonized. Preserved, but mocked. But the anomalies persist. The text describes the world as a square earth with 4 cardinal quadrants, bordered by great seas, with sacred mountains rising in spiral formations from which all rivers descend. This cosmography is echoed in other ancient systems, in Mesopotamian ziggurats, Indian Meru, even the Norse Yggdrasil. How did such symmetry arise across continents? The Shan Hai Jing also describes astronomical events, planetary alignments, and seasonal rituals that scholars now believe encoded sophisticated calendrical knowledge. Solar terms, lunar cycles, eclipses. And yet, its beasts make it easy to ignore. Creatures with 9 tails, birds with human faces, beings who weep blood and walk backward. These are dismissed as fantasy, but what if they are not? What if the text encodes psychological or spiritual states in zoological form? What if the monsters are not false, but symbolic rituals of description for energies too subtle to name? Modern researchers have speculated that the Shan Hai Jing preserves fragments of shamanic cartography, that it reflects a memory of an earlier Chinese cosmology, pre-dynastic, animistic, multidimensional, where the boundary between gods and beasts was porous, and ritual was navigational. It is perhaps no coincidence that many of the deities described in the text are female, or androgynous, or elemental. They are not fathers in the sky. They are tides, forests, winds, metal. And that threatens Confucian patriarchy. And imperial hierarchy. In one passage, it describes a mountain where the sun rests, guarded by a bird with 3 legs. In another, it mentions a river that leads to the land of the immortals. In yet another, it warns of a beast who appears before floods. These are not myths. They are omens. And here the contradiction sharpens. In ancient Chinese bronze inscriptions and oracle bones, some of these very symbols appear: the 3-legged crow, the phoenix rising from flames, the serpentine dragon of the East. So which came first, the myth or the state? In the Tang and Song dynasties, there was a brief revival of interest in the Shan Hai Jing. Scholars such as Guo Pu annotated it, trying to decode its symbols. But the rise of Neo-Confucian orthodoxy during the Ming once again exiled it from the serious bookshelf. It became folklore, superstition, child's reading, and yet emperors still consulted it. During the Yuan and early Qing dynasties, copies of the Shan Hai Jing were kept in imperial libraries. Some geomancers and court astrologers used it in secret, mapping ritual space according to its mountains. Its cosmography did not die, that it simply moved underground. In modern times, the Shan Hai Jing has resurfaced as a subject of fascination among crypto-historians, folklorists, and esoteric scholars. Some claim it encodes memories of a prehistoric migration. Others suggest it records hallucinations induced by ritual trance. A few even argue it preserves contact with beings not of this world. What is certain is this: it does not fit. It does not fit the rationalist frame. It does not fit nationalist historiography. It does not fit any religious dogma. It is a book out of place. A book that insists the earth is alive, that spirits dwell in stone, that beasts carry messages, that ritual opens gates, and that maps are not for roads, but for realities. So we are left with the unanswerable. Did the Shan Hai Jing describe a world long lost, or one still hidden in plain sight. There's a list older than memory, yet updated with every threat to control. It is not a book, but a vault. A shadow cast across centuries of thought. A living ledger of silenced voices. Its name is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. And unlike myth or legend, this one is documented, signed, sealed, enforced. Initiated in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, the Index was the Catholic Church's official record of works deemed heretical, profane, immoral, or subversive. But in truth, it was something more, a map of forbidden knowledge. A slow-burning pyre, alphabetized. The contradiction is immediate. If the Church held the truth, eternal, infallible, divinely revealed, why the need to suppress opposing ideas so systematically? Why not let heresy destroy itself by its own error? Unless the heresy said something the Church could not refute. The Index included the usual suspects: Luther, Calvin, Copernicus, Galileo, Spinoza. But then, Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Bruno, Behem, even Descartes for a time, entire scientific revolutions, philosophical frameworks, mystical treatises, books on medicine, astronomy, cosmology, politics, sexuality, banned not for lies, but for questions. And among them, books of power, the Key of Solomon, the Picatrix, the 3 books of occult philosophy, books of divination, alchemy, ritual, banned not for blasphemy, but for bypassing ecclesiastical mediation, because what is magic in its essence but unlicensed prayer? The deeper we descend into the Index, the more we find not corruption, but connection, systems of thought that link the cosmos to the body to intention, intention to matter. The kinds of systems that dismantle hierarchical religion by making every human a priest. The most dangerous books were not those that denied God, but those that insisted he was unnecessary. And here emerges the historical fracture. The Church burned Giordano Bruno in 1600, not for denying God, but for teaching that the universe was infinite, that stars were suns, and that other worlds existed, teeming with life. He drew from Hermeticism, from the Corpus Hermeticum, and from banned books that dared to fuse science with mysticism. Even Galileo, often portrayed as a scientific martyr, was not silenced solely for his heliocentrism, but for suggesting that the Bible was not a science book. That observation could correct Scripture. In the eyes of the Index, this was intolerable, because to correct Scripture was to correct God. And to correct God was to threaten the entire scaffolding of ecclesiastical power. But the Index was more than repression, it was revelation. It reveals, through its bans, what the Church feared. Not chaos, but clarity. The Popol Vuh, for instance, was not placed on the Index. It was burned before the Index was ever compiled. Indigenous texts were destroyed outright. The Aztecs, Maya, Inca, their cosmologies posed no threat of debate. They were annihilated. But books from within the European lineage, those required slower, death. Censorship. Condemnation. Exclusion. Consider this contradiction. Some of the most influential Catholic mystics were nearly censored. Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart. Their visions walked the razor's edge, too ecstatic, too inward, too uncontrollable. Some were silenced in life, only to be canonized centuries later. The Index reveals a church at war with itself, a spiritual lineage seeking transcendence, contained by a political machine demanding submission. And the machinery was vast. By the 17th century, books could not be published without imprimatur ecclesiastical approval. Libraries were purged. Students forbidden to read, quote, or even own certain texts. In some regions, owning a banned book meant excommunication. Yet, paradoxically, the forbidden books survived. In private libraries, in coded language, in annotations, hidden in margins, In the memories of those who read faster than the fire could burn, the index was updated regularly, methodically until 1948, and officially abolished only in 1966. But its logic persists. Modern censorship no longer requires a church. It lives in algorithm, platform, politic, preference. But the root remains the same: control of narrative, control of memory, control of thought. Even today, translations of books like the Picatrix or 3 books of occult philosophy circulate in heavily redacted or paraphrased forms. The raw texts, the full instructions, are harder to find. Their reappearance is often accompanied by warnings: for educational purposes only, use at your own risk. Who now is writing the new index? There is a final irony. Some books were placed on the index not for content, but for language. Translations of the Bible into vernacular tongues, English, German, French, were banned because a text in your own language becomes yours, and the church could not afford that. This was not about protection. It was about monopoly. So we must ask, what kind of truth must be guarded by prohibition? And if it needs protection, is it still truth? There is no original Bible. No scroll fell from the sky. No divine hand etched it whole in stone. No prophet assembled its chapters in the silence of revelation. What we call the Bible is not a single book, but a collection, chosen, curated, and cut by men. And that is the contradiction too few dare to confront. From the earliest centuries of Christianity, texts competed. Gospels circulated side by side, some familiar, some forgotten. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Some were read aloud in churches. Some were revered by saints. Others vanished, not because they were found false, but because they were not chosen. The process was not divine. It was political. In the 4th century, as Christianity moved from underground movement to imperial institution, the need for unity grew urgent. Belief had to be standardized, practice homogenized. Scripture defined. Enter the councils. The Council of Nicaea, 325 CE, is often mythologized as the moment when the canon was fixed. In reality, it focused on Christ's nature, affirming that Jesus was of one substance with the Father, opposing the Arian claim that he was created. But beneath that doctrinal debate, a more unsettling process had begun: the slow, deliberate sifting of what could be read and what could not. By the time of the Synod of Hippo, 393 CE, and the Councils of Carthage, 397 and 419 CE, a canon was being proposed: 27 books of the New Testament, the same we use today. No Gospel of Mary, no Apocalypse of Peter, no Wisdom of Solomon, no Didache. But why those 27? There is no surviving document from these councils that details the criteria. No list of reasons. Only the result. The selections are not chronological. James and Hebrews were among the last to be accepted, debated for decades. Revelation was nearly excluded entirely. 2 Peter barely made it, with authorship doubted. From the beginning, even the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are anonymous. The names were assigned later to lend authority. Scholars widely agree they are not eyewitness accounts, but theological narratives written decades after the events they describe, and yet they became gospel. And the others? Heresy. But the rejected texts tell a different story. The Gospel of Thomas offers no crucifixion, no resurrection, just 114 sayings of Jesus, many matching the canonical Gospels, others veering into mystical aphorism. The Gospel of Peter describes a talking cross and a resurrection witnessed by Roman guards. The infancy Gospel of Thomas depicts a young Jesus shaping birds from clay and bringing them to life, a miracle echoed in the Quran centuries later. Were these accounts too fantastical? Or too intimate? The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip both portray Mary Magdalene not as a background figure, but as the bearer of secret knowledge favored by Jesus. Peter, in these texts, is jealous. Is that why they were cut? The Acts of Paul and Thecla tells of a female disciple who baptizes herself, resists marriage, survives execution, and becomes a preacher. A challenge to male authority embedded in divine narrative. Is that why it was condemned? Every excluded. Text tells us not what the early church believed, but what it feared. And the process was never clean. Eusebius of Caesarea, the first great church historian, writing in the early 4th century, divides Christian texts into 3 categories: accepted, disputed, and rejected. The Book of Revelation, disputed. The Epistle of Barnabas, disputed. The Shepherd of Hermas, once accepted, later erased. In his ecclesiastical history, he hints at the chaos beneath consensus. Some books are accepted by some churches, others by others. There was no single canon. Only overlapping circles of tradition. The eventual canon became dominant not because of theological superiority, but because of institutional power. When Constantine converted to Christianity and made it the empire's favored religion, unity became paramount. Doctrinal deviation became political threat. A fragmented scripture was too dangerous. So the councils cut. It was a blade, not a revelation. By the time the Vulgate, the Latin translation by Jerome, became standard in the West, the list was locked. But even Jerome doubted the inclusion of certain books. In his letters he questions the Epistle of James, the Book of Judith, Tobit, Maccabees. He translated them. But reluctantly, centuries later, the Protestant Reformation would fracture the canon again, removing the Apocrypha, reordering books, translating into the vernacular. Each change framed as a return to truth. But whose truth? And now, even outside the church, the idea of the Bible as a complete and unchanging book persists. But history says otherwise. The original scriptures were fluid, open, multivocal. The canon, fixed by councils and copied by scribes, is a snapshot of power at a moment in time. So we must ask, if scripture is defined by vote, what else did they leave out? Time is supposed to be the one thing we cannot touch, immutable, linear, universal. And yet, what if history itself, the very sequence of years we live by, has been altered? What if centuries were fabricated, inserted, shifted, to serve the illusion of continuity? This is not the premise of science fiction. It is the claim of real historians, scholars, and dissidents across centuries, a theory unsettling enough to fracture every assumption of recorded time. And it begins with a simple question. Why does so much of early medieval history feel like a void? The period between roughly 614 CE and 911 CE, known as the Early Middle Ages, is often called the Dark Ages. But the darkness is more than metaphor. Records vanish. Architecture stagnates. Innovation stalls. Entire regions show little to no change. Chronicles become inconsistent, vague, or suspiciously repetitive. This temporal gap is the seed of the phantom time hypothesis, proposed by German historian Herbert Illig in the 1990s. He argued that roughly 300 years, from 614 to 911 CE, were artificially inserted into history by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II around the year 1000. Why? To place themselves at the symbolic turning point of the first Christian millennium. In other words, to become rulers of 1000 AD, they needed to create years to get there. Preposterous? And yet, evidence accumulates. Illig and others point to numerous contradictions. Archaeological layers in Central Europe show little difference between the supposed 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. Coinage from the period is often duplicated across regions, sometimes with identical dyes used over decades. Construction records repeat. Annals of Kings recycle reign lengths with suspicious regularity. And perhaps most disturbing, the Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE, drifted from the solar year by 11 minutes annually. By the time Pope Gregory XIII reformed it in 1582, the calendar should have been 13 days off, but it was only off by 10. Where did those 3 missing days go? Or more pointedly, where did those 300 years come from? Mainstream historians reject Illig's theory. They cite Byzantine records, Islamic scholars, Chinese astronomers, all marking events during the so-called phantom centuries, but even these citations contain fissures. Calendars, across civilizations, rarely synchronize. The Islamic calendar, lunar by design, drifts from the solar cycle. The Chinese calendar resets dynasties with heavenly mandates, not universal reckoning. East and West do not share time. They never did. So why do our textbooks pretend otherwise? There are stranger anomalies. In the Carolingian Renaissance, a supposed cultural revival in the 8th and 9th centuries, Latin manuscripts suddenly reappear with sophistication lost since Rome, but no clear lineage connects them. It's as if literacy vanished and then returned fully formed. Charlemagne himself, the central figure of this epoch, is a puzzle. Described as a giant, a unifier, a lawgiver, a king of kings. But the surviving statues, coins, and writings are shockingly sparse. His biography, penned by Einhard, mirrors Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars to an eerie degree, including entire phrases. Is Charlemagne a person or a constructed symbol? Why does the architecture of Aachen, his capital, look Roman, while other regions remained wooden and primitive? The deeper question emerges: could chronology itself have been forged? Because to control time is to control truth. Religious institutions have always held time as sacred: calendars, feasts, Sabbaths, jubilees. Empire demands its own calendar, marked not by the heavens, but by conquest. The French Revolution redefined the week. Soviet time abolished. Sunday. Rome named months after emperors. The Gregorian calendar, still in use, was declared by papal bull. Time is not neutral. It is dictated. And when time is written, it can be rewritten. Many medieval records were copied by monastic scribes centuries after the events they describe. Few original manuscripts survive. Layers of rewriting blur origins. Historians rely on synchronisms, mentions of eclipses, comets, celestial events, to ground chronology, but even these are not immune. Eclipses can be misdated, comet appearances misaligned, and if forgers understood the cycles or simply made vague references, the illusion of accuracy could be preserved. This is how a fictional century becomes real, and it would not be the first time. The forged nonation of Constantine, used to legitimize papal authority in the Middle Ages, claimed that the Roman emperor had ceded authority to the Pope. It was fabricated, proven a fraud by Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century, but it shaped 1,000 years of power. What if our entire chronology rests on similar fabrications? Other scholars, such as Anatoly Fomenko in Russia, take this further, arguing that all of antiquity is compressed, and that ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt are duplications of later events. His new chronology is controversial, but raises real questions. Why do dynastic lists from different civilizations mirror each other in rhythm, names, reign lengths? Why do some historical figures seem to echo others, as if the same template were reused? We are told history is a straight line, but what if it's a palimpsest? Scraped clean, rewritten, layered. What if time itself has been engineered? And if that is true, how many centuries are we living inside a lie? There is a tension buried deep in the marrow of history, a fracture line not between nations, but between realities. Western civilization tells a singular story, from Sumer to Greece. From Rome to Christendom, from Enlightenment to Empire. A clear arc, a continuous flame. But the East, India, China, Mesoamerica, tells a different tale, one built on cycles, on returns, on realms unseen. The contradiction is not just one of mythology, dotted as temporal. When Western historians write history, they date events according to the Gregorian calendar, itself a papal correction of Caesar's Julian scheme. But the East used other measures: lunar dynasties, solar kingships, rain calendars, cosmic wheels. The result? Histories that do not align, epochs that overlap without matching, events that echo across timelines, but never meet. Take China's historical record, the 24 histories, a chronological account of emperors, disasters, and omens, spanning more than 3,000 years. These records are meticulous, eclipses noted, floods marked, births aligned with constellations. And yet, when we try to synchronize them with Western timelines, the dates slip. A solar eclipse recorded in the Book of Han doesn't match the astronomical data unless one shifts the timeline. Some reigns last too long, others are duplicated. Names are changed to match cosmic principles, not empirical fact. Are these errors? Or is the assumption that time is singular the real mistake? The deeper contradiction lies in what we consider history. In the West, history is external. Battles, treaties, rulers. In the East, history was often internal. Omens, dreams, harmonics between heaven and earth. In China, the mandate of heaven did not require divine blood. It required cosmic alignment. When a ruler lost harmony with the universe, droughts came, stars shifted, rebellion was justified. In India, the Yugas, vast cosmic ages, described humanity's descent through cycles of moral decline. Not centuries. These aren't timelines. They're Tim escapes. So what happens when we try to map one onto the other? We distort both. European colonizers and missionaries, in their urge to catalog and control, tried to translate Asian time into Western terms. Chinese dynasties were pinned to B, CE, and CE. Hindu epics were recast as myth, not memory. The Maya long count was declared superstition, despite tracking celestial cycles with uncanny accuracy. But the problem runs deeper. What if some events happened more than once, or never at all? In the Japanese Nihon Shoki, there are emperors whose reigns span centuries. In the Indian Puranas, time is measured in kalpas, epochs millions of years long. The Mayan calendar begins not in history, but in myth. 3114 BCE, before Abraham, before Sumer, yet it tracks real planetary cycles. How did they know? One unsettling hypothesis: these civilizations remembered cycles we forgot. Or worse, they remembered cycles that were erased. Western history often begins with Greece. But the Greeks themselves claimed their wisdom came from Egypt, Chaldea, and the East. Herodotus wrote of Egyptian priests, showing him king lists that stretched back 17,000 years. Plato spoke of Atlantis, a civilization lost in a previous age, preserved in memory by Egyptian sages. These claims were dismissed as myth, because they didn't fit the timeline. But what if the timeline is broken? The chronological frameworks we use today were assembled in early modern Europe by Jesuits, colonial administrators, Enlightenment rationalists. They imposed linearity where none existed. They placed Moses before Confucius, Christ before Buddha, but the evidence is not so tidy. Chinese astronomical records from as early as 1300 BCE mention the planet Jupiter in configurations that challenge conventional dating. Indian temples encode solstice alignments and lunar nodes with precision. Ancient Cambodian inscriptions mention star paths that match modern orbital data. If their time was wrong, how did they get the sky right? Even architecture resists synchronization. Megalithic site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to 9600 BCE. far older than any known civilization. It features celestial alignments, carved animals, and abstract motifs later echoed in Sumer, Egypt, and Mesoamerica, but there's no clear cultural path connecting them, only resonance. This hints at something disturbing. What if multiple timelines unfolded simultaneously, each anchored to different cosmologies? What if history as we know is not a singular thread, but a braided rope, strands of experience moving in parallel, occasionally touching, but fundamentally incompatible? The East-West inversion is not just one of geography. It is one of ontology. Western time moves forward. Creation gives fall, gives redemption, gives end. Eastern time returns. Birth gives decay, gives rebirth, gives dissolution. These are not metaphors. They shape how events are recorded, interpreted, remembered, and when forced into a single chronology, something breaks. Modern attempts to reconcile timelines often result in erasure. Events that cannot be dated are mythologized. Names are transliterated until unrecognizable. Whole periods are labeled legendary. But who decides what counts as legend, and why is the East always the one to be corrected? Even now, the global South is taught to date its history according to a Western schema. Ancient dynasties are placed in BCE. Post-colonial states record independence in CE. The Gregorian calendar reigns, a papal artifact posing as neutral time. But beneath it, other clocks still tick. The Chinese lunar calendar still begins with the Spring Festival. The Islamic calendar counts from the Hijra. The Hebrew year 5785 says something entirely different about creation. Which one is real? Or are they all fragments of something older and lost? So we are left with a haunting question. What if the histories of East and West are not opposite, but reflections in a broken mirror? There is a power subtler than armies, quieter than laws, older than empires. It does not command by sword or sermon, but by inscription. By ledger, by scroll, by seal. It is the archive. And if history is written by the victors, it is archived by those who know victory is temporary. Across time, civilizations have risen not merely by building walls or forging weapons, but by recording. And what they chose to record and what they chose to omit shaped what we now call history. This is the architecture of control. The Sumerians were among the first. Their cuneiform tablets, small, unassuming, cataloged grain, livestock, debt. But behind this bureaucracy lies something deeper, a worldview where reality becomes real only when written. The gods of Sumer were not worshipped by faith, but managed through ledgers. Temple economies tracked sacrifice, lunar cycles, and celestial omens in the same script used to record taxes. The divine and the mundane shared ink. This collapse of difference is the origin of the archive as empire. Fast forward to ancient Egypt. The House of Life, part temple, part library, was the domain of priest scribes who copied, corrected, and canonized. In it were stored medical texts, incantations, king lists, cosmological diagrams, and royal decrees. But where are they now? The vast majority of Egypt's papyri are lost to flood, fire, war, and silence. We reconstruct dynasties through fragments, inscriptions, and what was preserved, often by the Greeks. That's the contradiction. The farther back we go, the more dependent we become on later interpretations. The Ptolemies restructured Egyptian time, the Romans redated reigns, and modern historians often rely on these imperialized translations, layers upon layers of record. Rewritten. The Roman Empire perfected the archive, with its census, legal codices, and imperial correspondences. Rome created a state not just of roads and armies, but of documentation. To exist within the empire was to be counted, registered, taxed. The Fasti Consulæres, lists of Roman magistrates, structured time itself. The res gesta of Augustus immortalized his deeds in stone across provinces. And every governor, every soldier, every provincial administrator relied on written instruction. Empire was not just enforced. It was transcribed. But transcription is a double-edged tool. What gets archived is preserved. What does not vanishes. Consider this. The Library of Alexandria, so mythologized, may have held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, philosophical treatises, foreign texts, scientific theories. Its destruction is shrouded in contradiction. Burned by Caesar, Christians, Muslims. Each story shifts blame. None restores the content. And once the page is ash, the memory is negotiable. Who then decides what remains? In medieval Europe, the monasteries became the vaults. Scriptoria copied texts for generations, but selectively. Pagan works were expurgated. Passages inked out. Margins annotated with moral correction. Even Aristotle, rediscovered through Arabic intermediaries, arrived filtered. It was not a question of survival. It was a question of approval. The Vatican's secret archives, stretching back over 12 centuries, remain to this day largely closed. Only a fraction is digitized. Access is limited. Why does a church devoted to truth lock its past in shadow? Because archives are not passive. They are active tools. What is stored becomes what is real. What is excluded becomes fiction or heresy. Even language is subject to archival will. During the Qin dynasty, China underwent a radical standardization. Characters, weights, measures, even thought. The burning of books under Emperor Qin Shi Huang aimed to erase the 100 schools of thought, consolidating memory under legalist doctrine. Only texts on medicine, agriculture, and prophecy were spared. Why prophecy? Because even tyrants fear the future. This template repeats. The Spanish conquest of the Americas did not just bring muskets, it brought notaries. Entire codices were burned. Indigenous histories, encoded in pictographs and glyphs, were declared diabolical. Yet some missionaries copied fragments before destruction. Which ones? We may never know. The Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagun, preserves Nahua beliefs, but through Christian interpretation. The archive survives. But it is already translated, already altered. And now, in the digital age, the archive expands again. But faster than we can comprehend. Every click, every message, every transaction becomes data. But who owns it? Governments archive surveillance. Corporations archive behavior, and both promise security while eroding memory. What happens when truth is not deleted, but buried under terabytes of trivia? What happens when curation replaces censorship? Even AI, like the one speaking now, is trained on archives. But what was fed? What was left out? Who trained the machine? And to whose story? We assume that what is recorded is what occurred. But the archive does not reflect reality. It constructs it. And the cost of misrecording is erasure. We may never know how many gospels, dynastic records, astronomical tables, or spiritual treatises were lost, not to disaster, but to decision. One scribe chooses not to copy a scroll. One ruler declares a purge. One librarian removes a shelf, and a century later, that gap becomes doctrine. That silence becomes consensus. So we must ask, if the archive is a cathedral of memory, who guards the door? There is a secret buried beneath the page, not in the words but behind them, a ghost language, a second voice. A story overwritten but not destroyed. It is called a palimpsest. From the Greek palin, again, and cestos, scraped. A palimpsest is a manuscript page that has been erased and reused but never entirely. The original ink, once scraped or washed away, leaves behind faint stains, spectral traces, under certain light, under forensic tools, under patient fingers. The lost voice returns. And with it, the deeper contradiction of our entire historical Record. What if the past we read is not the first version? What if our entire tradition rests on recycled memory? This is not metaphor. It is physical. The most famous example is the Archimedes palimpsest, a 10th century Byzantine prayer book, seemingly ordinary until modern technology revealed beneath it the writings of Archimedes, including treatises on infinity, mechanics, and geometry unknown for centuries, the greatest mathematical mind of antiquity. Erased to make space for Christian hymns. What does it mean that the Church chose to copy liturgy over science? What other minds were lost to doctrine? The layering of thought did not stop there. In the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, the overwritten text contains works by Ephraim the Syrian, but beneath, fragments of biblical texts in Greek, another manuscript, hides the works of Euripides under theological commentaries. The palimpsest is not rare. It is the rule. Parchment was expensive. Scribes reused what they could. But the choice of what to erase and what to preserve was not random. Theological orthodoxy triumphed over heterodoxy. Liturgical repetition over poetic variance. Dogma over dissent. And the evidence is still bleeding through. Multispectral imaging now allows us to read the layers of ancient texts once thought lost. Libraries across the world, Sinai, Paris, Rome, are filled with manuscripts whose undertexts are only now being deciphered. In 2017, researchers discovered a hidden version of the Acts of the Apostles in Syriac beneath a monastic text. It contains subtle differences in wording, shifts in meaning, not doctrinal errors, but doctrinal possibilities. The palimpsest, then, becomes a metaphor for our civilization. What truths lie beneath our textbooks? What philosophies under our rituals? What calendar beneath our clock? Even beyond parchment, the palimpsest emerges in stone. Temples built atop older shrines, churches erected on pagan sites, mosques constructed over cathedrals, which were once Roman basilicas, which were once sacred groves. The ground itself is a layered script. In Rome, the Basilica of San Clemente is a literal vertical timeline, a 12th century church atop a 4th century church atop a 1st century Mithraic temple. Each level erased, overwritten, blessed, and then buried. This pattern repeats. Mexico. City sits atop the Aztec Templo Mayor. Notre Dame stands over a Roman temple to Jupiter. The Dome of the Rock overlays Solomon's temple. Why do the centers of worship share the same ground? Is it coincidence or conquest? Continuity or cover-up? And then there is the human mind. Cognitive science now tells us that memory is palimpsestic. We do not store perfect records. We overwrite, re-edit. Every recall alters the trace. We forget, and then remember the forgetting as truth. History, too, forgets. The Renaissance was not a rebirth, but a recovery. Ancient texts, long buried in monasteries, re-emerged. Plato, Plotinus, Lucretius, all returned not through preservation, but resurrection. We imagine progress as linear. But the palimpsest tells a different tale. Not ascent, but recursion. Even language shows its layers. The word God traces back to Gudum, an Indo-European root possibly meaning that which is invoked. The sacred begins as a call, not a being, and beneath our alphabets, cuneiform, hieroglyph, symbol, image. What was the first word? What was the first silence? And what was scraped away to make space for scripture? Digital technology now offers its own palimpsest. Hard drives overwritten, files deleted, but not destroyed. Metadata, version history. Digital forensics. We live surrounded by ghosts of data, forgotten until revealed. The archive never forgets. It only hides. And so we must wonder, how many versions of history lie beneath the one we're taught? How many erased gospels, inverted calendars, forbidden rituals still breathe in the margins? What would we find? If we read between the lines, we were taught that time is an arrow, precise, forward, indivisible. that history is a straight road, paved with facts, where each century stacks neatly atop the next, that events follow cause, that memory is measurable, that calendars are neutral instruments. But by now, that myth is crumbling. What if time doesn't move in a line? What if the past is not behind us, but beneath us? What if the ground we stand on is made of cycles and loops, edits and errors, palimpsests and paradox? The records we've traced, from Enoch's fallen watchers to the watcher of the skies and Picatrix, from the erased voice of Mary to the fabricated years of phantom time, do not form a single narrative. They form fractures. Each text we uncovered was not merely lost, it was removed. Each manuscript was not forgotten, it was silenced. And always, what lay beneath threatened to collapse the illusion of order, because history, as we know it, was constructed not to tell the truth, but to preserve power. And power fears time more than anything else. Empires rise and fall, but time remembers. Unless, of course, it is rewritten. And we've seen now how it was, by church councils selecting which books to keep, by scribes scraping away ancient thought, by kings adjusting calendars to center themselves in eternity. The illusion of continuity depends on deletion. There are no fixed centuries, only agreed upon intervals. No absolute chronologies, only overlapping myths. A temple buried beneath a palace, beneath a church, beneath a bank. We tried to synchronize east and west, but the maps don't align. The stars don't match, the stories don't fit. The Popol Vuh begins before time, loops through destruction, and begins again. The Shanhai Jing lists beasts not of this world, but remembers their names. The Book of Jubilees declares our calendar corrupt. The Voynich manuscript encodes an unreadable alphabet that may not be meant to be read. Even our tools of reckoning betray us. Astronomers mark missing eclipses. Historians trace duplicated rulers. Civilizations appear to rise from nothing, then vanish without trace. We call these dark ages. But what if they're not dark, only overwritten? We assumed that the collapse of Rome gave way to the light of Christendom. But what if time itself collapsed and was patched over? The Index Librorum Prohibitorum banned books not because they were false, but because they were too close to something true, true enough to destabilize the scaffolding. Dangerous not in error, but in clarity. Even now, digital time accelerates. But what does it record? Our data is archived, versioned, compressed. We scroll through thousands of images, none preserved. The illusion of permanence becomes its own erasure. Who will read this century, and what will they be allowed to see? There is a reason the ancients spoke of kairos, sacred time, time out of time, as distinct from chronos, the measured tick of hours. We have lost kairos, but the forbidden text whispered of it. The Corpus Hermeticum taught that the soul descends through the spheres and can ascend again. Gnostic Gospels claim time began with a forgetting, and salvation is a remembering. The Codex Gigas offered both Bible and spell, as if to say, sacred and profane are not opposites. They are mirrors, and the Key of Solomon gave rituals to make the planets obey, as if history were not only record, but spell work. So what now? If we accept that history was curated, time recalibrated, truth rewritten, what remains? Silence, confusion, or something else? Perhaps freedom, because if the arrow of time is broken, then we are no longer bound by its dictates. If the canon is not complete, then revelation is still possible. If the archive is haunted, then the ghosts still speak. The collapse of linear time is not chaos. It is potential. A return to the multiplicity the councils tried to flatten. A resurrection of timelines long buried beneath empire and ink. A realization that every myth contains a memory, and every memory a map. And so we end not with an answer, but with the question they feared most: what if the past isn't over,